Hey everybody, and welcome to another deep dive. You ready to talk about the future?
Always.
Okay, great. Because today we're going to be looking at something really cool and a little bit scary too.
Sounds about right.
We asked 4 different AIs what they thought the world would look like in 50 to 100 years. Who's going to be in charge? What's it going to look like?
Yeah, fascinating question.
Right. I mean, it's one thing for us to sit around and speculate, but to actually have artificial intelligence weigh in on it.
Exactly. And they have access to so much more data than we do as individuals.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, they can analyze trends and patterns and historical data and all sorts of things that we couldn't even begin to wrap our heads around.
Right, and synthesize it in a way that we just can't.
Exactly. So this is going to be really interesting to kind of see what they come up with. Now, before we jump in, just a quick reminder to like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below if you're enjoying the content. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Let's dive in, shall we?
Let's do it.
Okay, so first up, we've got Copilot. Now, Copilot seems to be very much a numbers kind of AI.
Yeah, very data-driven.
Exactly. Very data-driven, very probability-based. So they're looking at things like economic growth, technological advancements, and geopolitical dynamics.
So basically taking those elements, trying to predict who's going to be the most powerful based on where things are going.
Yeah, basically extrapolating from current trends to see who's likely to come out on top.
Makes sense.
Right? So according to Copilot, their top contender is China.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they give China a 40% probability of leading the world in the next century.
40%, that's pretty significant.
It is. It's a pretty hefty chunk.
Yeah.
Now the U.S. comes in second at 30%.
Okay, so still a strong contender.
Still in the running. Yeah, absolutely. And then we have the EU at 15%, India at 10%, and then they've got this little wild card category of other emerging powers, which they give a 5% probability to.
I like that they have the wild card category.
Yeah, it's kind of like the who knows what crazy stuff might happen category.
Yeah, exactly. Because we're talking about 50 to 100 years in the future. Anything could happen.
Exactly. So it's interesting that Copilot puts China ahead.
Yeah, what's their reasoning for that?
Well, they point to China's continued economic growth, which has been pretty remarkable over the past few decades.
It has been.
Right.
Yeah.
And they also highlight China's strategic investments in infrastructure and technology. They're really pouring resources into things like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and renewable energy.
Yeah, they're playing the long game for sure.
Absolutely. And Copilot seems to think that those investments are going to pay off big time in the long run.
So they're not just looking at where things are now, but where they're headed.
Exactly. It's not just about current power, but about the potential for future power.
That makes sense.
Now, it's not like Copilot is discounting the U.S. entirely.
Right, they still have them at 30%.
Exactly. They still see the U.S. as a major player on the world stage. And they acknowledge America's existing strengths, like its strong military, its powerful economy, and its global cultural footprint.
Yeah, the U.S. still has a lot going for it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But Copilot also points out some of the internal challenges that the U.S. is facing.
Yeah, we've all seen those playing out.
Right. Things like political polarization, economic inequality, and the rising national debt.
Yeah, those are definitely factors to consider.
And Copilot suggests that these internal challenges could potentially hinder America's long-term dominance.
So it's a bit of a get your house in order message.
Exactly. It's like they're saying, hey, the U.S. still has the potential to be a major player, but it needs to address these issues if it wants to stay ahead of the curve.
Interesting. So it's a tight race between China and the U.S., at least according to Copilot.
Yeah, a real nail-biter. But we've only heard from one AI so far. Let's see what our second AI expert, Claude, has to say about all of this.
All right, bring on Claude.
So Claude, unlike Copilot, takes a more nuanced approach.
Oh, how so?
Well, instead of just focusing on probabilities, Claude explores different scenarios and considers a wider range of factors.
I see. So they're looking at a bigger picture.
Yeah, they're really trying to paint a more comprehensive and detailed picture of what the future might hold.
Sounds like they're going for depth over just pure prediction.
Exactly. They're not just saying, this is who's going to win. They're saying, here are a bunch of different possibilities, and here's how they might play out.
Okay, I like that. I like that approach.
So, according to Claude, the most probable scenario is actually Chinese global leadership.
Oh, so they agree with Copilot on that one.
On that one, yes. They give that a 27% probability, so slightly lower than Copilot, but still the most likely outcome in their view.
Okay, so China's still a strong contender, even with this more nuanced approach.
Absolutely. But here's where things get interesting. Claude's second most likely scenario is a multipolar system with regional powers taking center stage. and they give that a 23% probability.
Multipolar, so no single superpower calling all the shots, more of a balance of power.
Exactly. Power would be distributed among multiple centers of influence, rather than concentrated in one dominant nation.
That's a very different world than the one we're living in today.
It is, but it's a possibility that Claude seems to think we need to take seriously. And that's not all. Claude throws in a few curveballs as well.
Oh, like what?
Well, they give an 18% probability to an AI-driven technocratic order.
Wait, AI running the world? Seriously?
That's what they're suggesting. Essentially, advanced artificial intelligence would be making the decisions, perhaps even governing societies.
Wow, that's a pretty wild scenario.
Right. It sounds like something straight out of science fiction, but Claude seems to think it's a legitimate possibility, at least within the realm of 50 to 100 years.
It makes you wonder, what role would humans even play in a world like that?
Exactly. It raises all sorts of questions of the nature of power, governance, and even what it means to be human in a technologically advanced world.
Mind-blowing stuff.
It is. But wait, there's more.
More.
Claude also gives a 12% probability to the U.S. maintaining its leadership.
Okay, so they're not counting the U.S. out completely.
Not at all. They're just saying it's less likely than some of these other scenarios. Then they give 8% to a unified and powerful European Union emerging as a major force on the world stage.
Interesting. So a more integrated and assertive EU.
Exactly.
Huh.
And finally, they give 7% to an India-led alliance shaping the global landscape.
India, huh? They've been on the rise for a while now.
They have. And Claude seems to think they could play a significant role in shaping the future world order.
Wow, so many possibilities. It's almost overwhelming.
It is. But that's what makes this so fascinating. We're not looking at a single prediction, but at a whole spectrum of potential futures.
Yeah, and it's a good reminder that the future isn't set in stone.
Exactly. It's shaped by the choices we make today.
Absolutely. So, compared to Copilot, Claude paints a much more uncertain and complex future.
They do. And I think that's a valuable perspective because it forces us to think outside the box and consider possibilities that we might not have otherwise imagined.
Yeah, no more black and white thinking. This is about shades of gray.
Exactly. It's about embracing the complexity and recognizing that the future is full of surprises.
Makes you think, doesn't it? So anything in particular that stood out to you in Claude's analysis?
Well, I think it's interesting that Claude assigns a much lower probability to the U.S. maintaining its dominance than Copilot does.
Yeah, that's a pretty significant difference.
It is. And I think it reflects Claude's greater emphasis on internal challenges facing the U.S. They seem to be more concerned about things like political polarization, economic inequality, and the potential for those issues to undermine America's long-term strength.
So they're saying that the U.S. needs to address its internal issues if it wants to remain a major player.
Exactly. They're not saying the U.S. is doomed, but they are saying that it needs to adapt and evolve if it wants to stay ahead of the curve.
It's a wake-up call, for sure.
It is. And Claude also highlights the rise of other powers, particularly China and India, as well as the potential impact of disruptive technologies like AI. They seem to be saying, don't get too comfortable with the current world order because things could change drastically in the coming decades.
So buckle up because the future is going to be a wild ride.
You got it. But we're not done yet. We still have 2 more AIs to hear from, and I have a feeling they're going to add even more layers of complexity to this whole discussion.
I can't wait. Let's bring on ChatGPT and see what they have to say.
All right, ChatGPT, take it away. What's your vision of the future?
So ChatGPT takes a slightly different approach again.
Yeah, they seem to be more focused on storytelling.
Oh, interesting. So instead of just spitting out numbers, they actually try to weave a narrative around their predictions.
Exactly. It's more like, here's how the story of the future might unfold, rather than just, here are the odds of this or that happening.
I like that. That makes it a lot more engaging, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it also helps to make the predictions feel more grounded, more relatable somehow.
Right, because it's not just abstract data points anymore. It's a potential reality that we can kind of visualize and connect with.
Exactly. So let's see what kind of story ChatGPT spins for us.
Let's hear it.
Okay, so ChatGPT starts by giving the U.S. a 35% probability of maintaining its global hegemony.
Okay, so they're a bit more optimistic about the U.S. than Claude was.
Yeah, they seem to think that the U.S. still has a decent chance of holding on to its top spot.
But it's not a guarantee, obviously.
Wait, it's still far from a sure thing.
What factors do they point to for that prediction?
Well, they acknowledge that the U.S. is facing some internal challenges, like those we talked about with Copilot.
Right, the political polarization, the economic inequality, all that.
Exactly. But they also emphasize America's adaptability and its ability to innovate and reinvent itself.
So they're saying that the U.S. has a history of overcoming challenges and coming out stronger on the other side.
That's their take on it. They see the U.S. as a nation that's constantly evolving and adapting to changing circumstances.
Interesting. It's kind of like that saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Right. And ChatGPT seems to think that the U.S. has a lot of fight left in it.
Well, that's good news for those of us who are rooting for the home team.
Exactly. But it's not going to be easy. ChatGPT still sees China as a major contender, giving them a 30% chance of taking the lead.
Okay, so it's still a very tight race between the U.S. and China.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And ChatGPT points to China's continued economic growth, its expanding global influence, and its strategic investments in key technologies like AI and renewable energy.
Yeah, we're seeing that play out in real time, aren't we?
We are, and ChatGPT seems to think that these trends are only going to accelerate in the coming decades.
So China is playing the long game, and they're playing it well.
That's what ChatGPT seems to be saying. But they also throw in some other interesting possibilities.
Oh, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
Okay, so they give India a 20% chance of emerging as a major global player.
India, huh? I can see that happening.
Yeah, they've got a massive population, a rapidly growing economy, and a young and increasingly educated workforce.
And they're already a major player in the tech world.
Exactly. So ChatGPT seems to think that India has the potential to really shake things up on the global stage.
A rising force to be reckoned with, for sure.
Absolutely. And then they give a 10% probability to a unified and powerful EU taking shape.
That's an interesting one. The EU has faced its share of challenges in recent years.
It has, but ChatGPT seems to think that those challenges could ultimately lead to a more integrated and assertive EU.
So out of the ashes of division, a stronger union could arise.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And a strong EU could definitely shift the balance of power on the global stage.
No doubt about it. What else does ChatGPT have in store for us?
Well, they also acknowledge the possibility of a multipolar world, giving it a 25% probability.
So no single superpower, but rather a network of powerful nations and alliances.
Exactly. It's a scenario where power is more distributed and cooperation becomes even more essential.
That would require a whole new way of thinking about global politics.
It would. It would present both challenges and opportunities for nations trying to navigate this new landscape.
Definitely a lot to unpack there. Anything else?
Oh, yeah. Here comes a curveball. ChatGPT gives a 15% chance to the rise of tech titans.
Tech titans, you mean like giant tech companies?
Yeah, think Google, Amazon, Tesla, companies like that.
Wow. Corporations as global leaders, that's a whole new level of power dynamics.
It is, and it's something that we're already seeing to some extent with the influence that these tech giants have on our lives.
Right. I mean, think about how much data they control, how much they influence our opinions, how much they shape our online experiences.
Exactly. And ChatGPT seems to think that this trend is only going to accelerate in the coming decades.
So we might be looking at a future where corporations wield as much power as nation-states.
That's the suggestion. And it raises all sorts of questions about accountability, regulation, and the role of government. In a world where corporations have so much power.
Big questions indeed. So we've got ChatGPT predicting a potential U.S. victory, the rise of China, a powerful India, a unified EU, a multipolar world, and even the emergence of corporate superpowers.
That's a lot to digest, and we're not done yet. We still have one more AI to consult. Grock.
Grock. Bring on the wisdom of the machines.
All right, Grock, what have you got for us? What's your take on the future of global leadership?
So Grok takes kind of a big picture approach.
Okay, in what way?
Well, they try to bring together all sorts of factors like economic trends, obviously, technological advancements. They even look at things like military capabilities, cultural influence, even environmental factors.
Wow, so they're really trying to consider everything.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to create this really comprehensive model of the world and how it's all interconnected.
So it's not just about who has the biggest army or the most money. It's about all these other subtle factors that can influence global power.
Exactly. And I think that's really important because the world is so complex and there are so many different forces at play.
Absolutely. So given all of that, what's Grock's verdict? Who do they see leading the pack in 50 to 100 years?
Well, interestingly enough, their predictions are very similar to Copilot's.
Really? So they're also putting China in the lead?
Yep. They give China a 40% probability of being the top dog, followed by the U.S. at 30%, the EU at 15%, India at 10%, and then that wild card category of other emerging powers at 5%.
Wow. So even with this more holistic approach, China still comes out on top.
It seems so, at least according to these two AIs.
Pretty fascinating that both Copilot and Grok, despite their different methodologies, arrived at such similar conclusions.
It is, isn't it? Makes you wonder if they're onto something.
It really does. So what do they see as the key factors driving these predictions? What are they emphasizing in their analysis?
Well, they both highlight the importance of economic momentum. China's economy has been growing at an incredible rate for decades now, and it shows no signs of slowing down.
Yeah, and they've got a huge population to fuel that growth.
Exactly. And they're also strategically positioning themselves on the global stage, with things like the Belt and Road Initiative, which is expanding their influence across Asia, Africa, and even into Europe.
So they're not just sitting back and waiting for things to happen. They're actively shaping the future to their advantage.
Exactly. They're playing the long game, and they're playing it very well.
Okay, so China's on the rise, but what about the U.S.? Do Copilot and Grok see any path for America to maintain its top spot?
They do, but they emphasize that it's not going to be easy.
Meaning what?
Well, they both stress that the U.S. needs to address some serious internal and external pressures if it wants to stay ahead of the curve.
Okay, let's break that down. What kind of internal pressures are they talking about?
Well, internally, they point to the need for the U.S. to really invest in innovation, education, and infrastructure, things that will boost its long-term economic competitiveness.
So basically investing in its future.
Exactly. And they also say that the U.S. needs to tackle issues like political polarization and economic inequality, which they see as real threats to its social cohesion and stability.
Yeah, those are some pretty deep-rooted issues.
They are, but Copilot and Grok seem to be saying that ignoring them is not an option. If the U.S. wants to remain a global leader, it needs to get its own house in order.
That's a tough message, but probably a necessary one.
Probably. And then there are the external pressures as well.
Okay, what are those?
Well, they're mainly talking about the rise of other powers, particularly China, and the need for the U.S. to adapt to a multipolar world.
So basically accepting that it's no longer the only game in town.
Right. And they suggest that the U.S. needs to strengthen its alliances, engage in strategic partnerships, and find ways to cooperate with other nations to address global challenges like climate change, pandemics, and economic instability.
So it's not just about military might or economic dominance anymore. It's about navigating this complex web of relationships and finding ways to collaborate and cooperate on a global scale.
Exactly. The world is becoming increasingly interconnected, and no nation can afford to go it alone anymore.
It's a whole new way of thinking about global leadership.
It is. It's not about dictating terms anymore. It's about building consensus, finding common ground, and working together to solve shared problems.
Okay, so we've heard from all four of our AI experts. We've got Copilot, Claude, ChatGPT, and Grok, and they've each given us their unique perspectives on the future of global leadership. Now, let's take a step back and try to synthesize all of this. What are some of the common threads that we're seeing emerge from these predictions? What are the big takeaways?
Well, one thing that's clear is that the future is anything but certain.
Yeah, we've got a lot of different scenarios on the table.
We do. But I think one thing that all four AIs agree on is that the U.S. and China are going to be the two major players on the world stage for the foreseeable future.
So that classic rivalry is going to continue to shape global events.
It seems likely, and they also all acknowledge the growing influence of India.
Yeah, they might not all agree on the extent of India's future power, but they all see it as a rising force that we need to pay attention to.
Absolutely. And I think another big takeaway is that the future of global leadership is going to be much more complex and multipolar than it is today.
So we're moving away from a world dominated by a single superpower.
It seems so, and I think that's a good thing.
Why is that?
Well, because it means that power will be more distributed, and that could lead to more cooperation and collaboration on global issues.
So less about competition and more about finding common ground.
Exactly. Of course, there are also risks associated with a multipolar world.
Like what?
Well, it could lead to more instability and conflict if nations can't find ways to work together effectively.
So the stakes are high.
They are, and that's why it's so important for us to be having these conversations and thinking critically about the future.
Absolutely. We need to be prepared for the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
We do. And we need to remember that the future isn't something that just happens to us. It's something that we create through our choices and our actions.
So it's not just about predicting the future, it's about shaping the future.
Exactly. And I think that's a very empowering message.
It is. And it's a good reminder that we all have a role to play in creating the kind of world we want to live in.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have. We've explored the predictions of 4 different AIs. We've discussed the potential implications of those predictions for our lives. And we've even touched on some of the philosophical questions about the nature of power, governance, and what it means to be human in a rapidly changing world.
It's been a wild ride.
It has,
Yeah.
but hopefully a thought-provoking one.
I think so too. So before we sign off, just a quick reminder to like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below if you enjoyed this deep dive. We always appreciate your feedback, and we love hearing your thoughts on these topics.
Absolutely. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
See you next time, folks.